I bought the property thinking I was stepping into a peaceful little paradise. A quiet neighborhood, a cozy house, and best of all, a private lake that stretched farther than I had imagined. The water was clear, the kind you could almost see straight to the bottom on a sunny day, and the surrounding trees made it feel like my own hidden sanctuary. I was excited to finally have a place where I could escape the noise of the city, a place where the only disturbances would be the occasional bird or the gentle ripple of the lake against the shore. At first, everything seemed perfect. Neighbors waved politely, the HOA newsletters arrived but felt harmless, and I told myself this was exactly what I had been looking for. I spent my first week exploring the shoreline, imagining summer barbecues, kayaking trips, and lazy afternoons fishing. I even started planting a few trees along the edge, thinking it would improve the scenery and give me some privacy. Little did I know, planting those trees would be the least of my problems. Then it started, small things at first. A polite note slipped under my door reminding me of HOA guidelines. A request to trim some branches that, according to them, might encroach on community views. I laughed it off, assuming they were just following protocol. After all, the guidelines said nothing about owning a lake. How could they? It was mine. Every inch of it was on the property deed, every boundary clearly marked. But the tension began to build without me noticing. It started with a phone call. The HOA president, a woman whose name I came to dread but will remain anonymous here, wanted to discuss community concerns. Her tone was unusually sharp, bordering on hostile. She mentioned something about lake access and community rights. I had no idea what she meant. As far as I knew, the lake was private. I told her so calmly, trying to keep the conversation polite. She didn't take it well. Her voice rose. She demanded that I provide access for neighbors, claiming there was some unwritten rule or tradition that allowed it. I tried to reason with her. I explained that the lake was part of my property, that I had purchased it legally, and that any access by others would be trespassing. She didn't respond to reason. Instead, she threatened action, vaguely hinting at fines, legal trouble, and even the involvement of local authorities. I laughed nervously, thinking she couldn't possibly escalate this. The escalation came faster than I could imagine. Just 2 days later, there was a knock at my front door. I opened it to find 2 uniformed police officers standing there, looking slightly confused, trying to appear professional. My stomach sank. This was it. The HOA had actually called the police over a lake. I didn't know whether to laugh or panic. The officers asked if I was aware that the HOA had reported a dispute over water access on my property. I assured them I owned the lake, that there were no violations, and that no one had the right to access it without my permission. They nodded, taking notes, clearly unsure of what to do with the situation. I could feel my blood pressure rising, partly from the absurdity of it all, partly from the knowledge that this could get messy. As they left, I closed the door slowly and leaned against it. The whole situation was surreal. I had bought a lake, a piece of paradise, and suddenly I was caught in what felt like a battle I didn't even know existed. I realized the HOA wasn't just a minor annoyance anymore. They were an active threat, willing to escalate and involve the police over a property I legally owned. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the confrontation in my mind. Every knock, every raised voice, every absurd claim by the HOA president. I felt a mix of anger, disbelief, and determination. I knew I couldn't let this slide. If they thought a phone call and a visit from the police could intimidate me, they were in for a surprise. I started researching my rights, reading every property law, every deed restriction, and every legal loophole I could find. It was late, but my resolve was clear. The lake was mine, and I wasn't going to let a petty HOA board take it away, no matter how dramatic they got. As I finally drifted into a restless sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that the next knock on my door would change everything. And somehow, I knew it wouldn't be just another visit from the police. The next morning, I woke up to the thought that maybe the previous day's police visit was a one-time misunderstanding. Maybe they would see reason and move on. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The moment I opened the front door, it became obvious how wrong I was. There they were again, 2 officers parked at the edge of my driveway, this time with clipboards, walking slowly toward me as if approaching some delicate crime scene. "Good morning, sir," one of them said, nodding politely. "We're here regarding the report about your lake." I took a deep breath and forced a smile, trying to appear calm. "I own the lake," I said, my voice steady. "There's no dispute." The officer glanced at his notes, unsure. "The HOA says there's restricted access, that you're preventing the community from using it." I couldn't help but chuckle, though it came out as more of a nervous laugh. "Restricted access? It's my private property. The deed clearly shows the lake is mine. No one has a right to come here without my permission." They nodded, clearly torn between enforcing some HOA complaint and acknowledging the reality of property law. I watched their hesitation, feeling a strange mixture of relief and frustration. Relief that they hadn't immediately taken sides with the HOA, frustration that this ridiculous situation had escalated to involving law enforcement at all. As I spoke, I caught sight of the edge of the lake in the distance. The water shimmered under the morning sun, completely peaceful, completely mine. For a brief second, I imagined the irony, HOA drama, and police visits, all because of a few acres of water. I smiled faintly to myself, but the smile faded when I remembered the seriousness of the situation. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. It was an active attempt to intimidate me, to test how far I would tolerate their nonsense. "Sir," the second officer said cautiously, "we just need to document the situation. The HOA claims you've been uncooperative and they want this on record." I nodded, fighting the urge to roll my eyes. "Understood. Everything you need is on my property deed and county records. The lake is private. There's nothing more to discuss unless the HOA takes legal action." The officers nodded again, scribbling notes, clearly feeling awkward about the absurdity of the whole thing. They asked a few more questions about the boundaries, the public access, and the state of the lake, but it was clear they didn't know what to do. After a few more minutes, they thanked me and left, leaving me staring at my driveway, thinking about how utterly ridiculous the situation had become. As I watched them drive away, I realized something important. The HOA had no idea what they were dealing with. They thought they could bully me, make threats, and drag the police into their petty battles. But they were stepping into territory they couldn't control. For every knock on my door, for every absurd complaint, I was learning more about my rights, and the more I learned, the stronger I felt. By the afternoon, emails and calls from the HOA started arriving in a flurry. They were polite at first, but the tone quickly shifted to veiled threats. Fines, legal consequences, and a community intervention were all mentioned. I read each message with growing disbelief and a quiet, simmering amusement. These people were acting as if a private lake was some shared community resource they could command at will. I decided to take a walk along the lake's edge, letting the cool water calm my nerves. As I looked out over the shimmering surface, the tension of the morning seemed almost surreal. It was peaceful, serene, and untouched by the chaos of human pettiness just beyond the tree line, and yet I knew the peace was fragile. The HOA wouldn't stop until they were forced to. The question was how far they would go and whether I could stay one step ahead. As the sun began to dip below the trees, casting long shadows across the water, I made a decision. I would respond, not with anger, not with threats, but with something far more effective. I would let the law speak for me. One carefully crafted notice could stop them in their tracks. I knew the words had to be precise, irrefutable, and firm. There could be no loopholes, no chance for them to argue back. As I turned back toward the house, I felt a surge of determination. The HOA had escalated the situation by calling the police, thinking it would intimidate me. Instead, it had awakened a new level of resolve. The lake was mine, the law was on my side, and I was ready to fight, but not in court yet. The first move had to be calculated, perfect, and final. I went inside and sat at the desk, opening my laptop. The glow of the screen reflected in my eyes as I began researching, drafting, and refining. Every word had to count. Every sentence had to close the door on their threats. And deep down, I knew one document could change everything. One letter could end this absurd battle before it truly began. And as I typed the first lines of what would become my legal notice, I felt a thrill of anticipation. The next time the HOA tried to push me around, the game would be very different. They thought they could intimidate me with police visits. Little did they know, they had just started a war they weren't prepared to fight. After the police left, and after the HOA's frantic emails piled up, I knew I couldn't just sit back and wait. This was getting out of hand, and if I didn't act, the intimidation would only escalate. I spent the evening poring over my property deed, county records, and local property laws. Every clause, every restriction, every tiny detail mattered. The more I read, the clearer it became. The HOA had no legal ground. The lake was mine in every sense of the word. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, feeling a strange mix of disbelief and satisfaction. The irony was delicious. They had called the police thinking they could scare me into giving up access to water I legally owned, and instead I had discovered a loophole, or rather, a rock-solid legal fact, that could end their interference once and for all. I made notes, highlighted key points, and even drafted rough versions of a legal notice in my head. Each draft tightened my grip on what I had, ownership, rights, and the law firmly on my side. As the night wore on, I started thinking about the HOA itself. They were obsessed with control. Little things mattered more than sense: lawn heights, mailbox colors, whether someone's welcome mat matched the community aesthetic. But this lake, this was my property, and they had gone too far. Calling the police had crossed a line. I couldn't let them think they could keep pushing. The more I read, the more I realized this wasn't just about the lake anymore. It was about principle. I imagined the HOA president reading my eventual notice. Her face would turn red, she would try to shout to argue, but she couldn't. The law didn't care about her opinion, her community traditions, or her imagined rights. That thought alone made me smile, a small, private victory before the battle had even begun. But I didn't let myself get ahead of the situation. It needed to be precise, careful, airtight. A single mistake could give them an opening to fight back. By midnight, I had a plan forming. I would draft a notice that did three things: stated my ownership clearly, cited the relevant laws, and warned them against any further attempts to access the lake or harass me over it. The tone had to be firm but professional, no unnecessary insults, no drama. The words had to carry weight simply because they were correct, irrefutable, and final. I knew once they read it, the HOA couldn't ignore it, argue with it, or twist it. As I typed, I paused frequently, rereading each line. The stakes felt enormous. This wasn't just a letter. It was a declaration, my property, my rules, and the suspense was intoxicating. The idea that one document could potentially end weeks of harassment made my pulse quicken. I knew the HOA wouldn't see it coming. They had overplayed their hand by involving law enforcement over a lake. Now the next move was mine. In my mind, I replayed the events. The first knock, the ridiculous claims, the officer taking notes with a straight face, the frantic emails from the board. Each memory added fuel to my determination. I realized how absurd it was, how completely over the top the situation had become, but also how satisfying it would be to see it resolved decisively. The power was shifting, and I was ready to seize it. As dawn approached, I stepped outside to look at the lake. The water was calm, untouched, serene. It seemed almost magical, a mirror reflecting my resolve. I imagined the chaos on the other side, the HOA scrambling, realizing too late that they had no authority here. The lake had become more than water and land. It was a symbol of everything I had fought for: my rights, my independence, my patience. I took a deep breath, letting the crisp morning air fill my lungs. The legal notice was ready in my mind, and soon on paper. All I had to do now was put it into words that could not be ignored, words that would shift the balance of power once and for all. This was no longer about responding to petty threats. This was about taking control, setting boundaries, and ensuring that the absurdity of their interference ended here. With one final glance at the lake, I felt a sense of calm determination wash over me. I had the law, I had the facts, and I had patience. The HOA thought they could push me around, but they were about to learn that one document could change everything. And as I sat down at my desk, ready to write the notice, I knew the suspense wasn't just for me. The board had no idea what was coming, and when they received it, the shock would be complete. One letter, one clear legal declaration, and the game would be over. The next morning, I woke with a sense of purpose. After nights of research, drafting, and double-checking every clause, every citation, the legal notice was finally ready. I had written it carefully, in precise language, stating my ownership of the lake, citing the relevant property laws, and making it clear that the HOA had no authority to demand access or interfere in any way. One letter, one document, could put an end to weeks of absurd drama. I printed it out, read it aloud, and then read it again. Every word mattered. I didn't want to sound hostile, only firm. No emotion, no room for argument. The law was on my side, and this letter had to reflect that. As I folded it neatly and placed it in an envelope, my pulse raced. I could almost feel the impact it would have on the board members, the shock, the frantic discussions, the disbelief. They had thought they could bully me, and now they were about to discover they had no leverage whatsoever. Delivering the notice wasn't about confrontation. I wanted it on record, and I wanted it official. I could have emailed it, but a hand-delivered copy felt more dramatic, more final. I grabbed my keys and drove to the HOA office, rehearsing what I would say if anyone tried to argue or stop me. I didn't expect a fight, but I wanted to be prepared. As I approached the building, I noticed a few board members lingering near the entrance, clearly anxious. Their faces shifted as I walked in, eyes narrowing, scanning me as if they could intimidate me. They couldn't, not today. I handed over the envelope to the secretary, keeping my tone calm. "This is the legal notice regarding the lake," I said. "Please ensure the board receives it immediately." There was a moment of stunned silence. The secretary glanced at the others, who were already whispering to each other, looking like they were trying to understand what just happened. I smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly. The first wave of tension had begun. Driving home, I felt a strange mix of anticipation and satisfaction. I knew that the real reaction would come soon, when the board read the notice and realized that their entire approach had been completely invalid. Weeks of threats, emails, phone calls, and even a police visit, all nullified by one letter. The absurdity of it made me chuckle quietly to myself. By the afternoon, the emails started arriving. The first few were terse, formal, almost like they were trying to act professional while hiding their panic. The subject lines were vague. "Regarding the notice" or "urgent board review." As I read through them, I realized the chaos had already begun behind the scenes. The board was scrambling to figure out how to respond, but legally they had nothing. Every word they typed felt forced, desperate, as if they were trying to negotiate with reality itself. The suspense built steadily over the next few hours. I imagined their meeting, the president waving the notice, pointing at the citations, her voice rising in disbelief, while other board members fumbled with papers, trying to find a loophole that didn't exist. I could almost hear the murmurs, the frustrated whispers, the realization dawning that they had misjudged me entirely. They had played their hand too early, underestimated my knowledge, and now faced the consequences. Late that evening, a phone call came. It was the secretary, politely, almost cautiously. "We've received your notice," she said. "The board will review it and respond accordingly." I smiled, keeping my voice calm. "Thank you. I look forward to your acknowledgement of my ownership rights." The line went silent for a moment, then she hung up. It was anticlimactic, yet satisfying. The letter had done its work without a single confrontation. As I walked back to the lake, the water glinting in the fading sunlight, I felt a sense of calm triumph. The lake was still mine, untouched by petty threats or overreaching authority. The police visits, the frantic emails, the imagined intimidation, all of it had led to this moment. I realized how powerful one well-crafted document could be when backed by knowledge and patience. But even as I enjoyed the victory, I knew the story wasn't over. The board wouldn't give up immediately, not when pride and ego were involved. There would be meetings, phone calls, maybe even attempts to pressure me further. The suspense wasn't just about legal rights anymore. It was about how far the HOA would go when faced with the undeniable truth. I sat by the water's edge, letting the ripples lap against the shore, and allowed myself a small smile. The first move had been mine, precise and decisive. The board had been stunned into silence, forced to reconsider everything they thought they knew. And I knew one thing for sure. The next chapter would bring even more drama, more absurdity, and perhaps one final confrontation that would cement the lake's status once and for all. The morning after the notice was delivered, I could already feel the tension in the neighborhood. It was subtle at first. The way neighbors avoided eye contact, the occasional glance toward my property, and the faint buzz of activity at the HOA office. It was as if everyone could sense the board's panic. The notice had landed, and the ripple effect had begun. By mid-morning, the emails started piling up again, but this time the tone was completely different. No longer polite or professional, they were frantic, defensive, even a little panicked. Threats of fines and warnings were still there, but now they seemed hollow, almost desperate. They were trying to act like nothing had changed, but I could feel the cracks forming in their confidence. I read each message carefully, letting the absurdity of their overreach sink in. They were still convinced they had power, still trying to negotiate with a reality that didn't bend. Then came the calls. I picked up the phone to hear the familiar voice of the HOA president, flustered, demanding explanations. She was trying to intimidate me again, waving around phrases like community standards and board authority. I listened patiently, letting her frustration build while keeping my voice calm. As stated in the notice, I said evenly, the lake is private property. The law supports my ownership, and any attempt to override that is invalid. There was silence on the other end, and I could almost hear her scrambling to think of a comeback. There wasn't one. By afternoon, I could feel the chaos spreading through the board. I imagined them huddled in the small meeting room, papers scattered across the table, everyone speaking at once, each member trying to salvage some sense of control. The president was probably packing, waving her hands, pointing to the notice, demanding someone find a loophole, and everyone else just shaking their heads. I couldn't help but smile, imagining the scene, so overblown, so dramatic, and yet completely powerless. I decided to take a walk along the lake just to clear my head. The water was calm, reflecting the late afternoon sun, but I felt a thrill knowing that this calm surface hid all the tension that had erupted in my absence. The HOA had assumed this would be a battle they could win with threats, intimidation, and the occasional police visit. Instead, they were being forced to confront reality, and reality was not on their side. As I walked, I noticed something interesting. A few neighbors who had previously been polite but distant were now stopping to talk. Curious questions, cautious observations, and even a hint of admiration. They were watching how the situation unfolded, sensing the drama but also recognizing that the board had overstepped. It was like watching a live show where the protagonist remained calm while the antagonists flailed helplessly. By evening, the tension reached another peak. The HOA president, in a desperate attempt to regain control, sent out an email calling a special board meeting. The subject line screamed urgency, but the underlying panic was obvious. They wanted to discuss next steps regarding the lake and my notice. I read it and leaned back in my chair, feeling the suspense building. They had no idea that the notice had already shifted the balance of power. Every frantic attempt to respond would only reinforce their defeat. That night I sat by the lake, the gentle lapping of the water against the shore calming my nerves. But I couldn't shake the anticipation. I knew the next confrontation was coming, and it would be theatrical. The president would appear, probably with papers in hand, maybe even a few board members in tow, hopping to intimidate me in person. The thought made my pulse quicken, but not with fear. This was the thrill of being in control, watching them stumble, powerless in the face of the law. As darkness fell, I realized the suspense wasn't just for me. The neighbors, the board, even the few onlookers who had caught wind of the drama were all waiting, wondering what would happen next. And I knew that the next day, when the president inevitably came to the lake, the stakes would rise even higher. The legal notice had worked, but the personal confrontation was inevitable. I smiled quietly to myself, taking in the stillness of the water, the cool night air, and the knowledge that I was ready. The board had been stunned, panic had set in, and now it was only a matter of time before the dramatic showdown at the lake. I didn't need to chase them or argue with them. They would come to me, and I would be prepared. The suspense hung thick in the air, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a thrilling sense of anticipation. The next chapter was about to unfold, and it would be unforgettable. It happened sooner than I expected. A quiet afternoon, the sun warm on the water, and then I saw her, HOA president, striding toward the lake with purpose. Not alone, of course. A couple of board members trailed behind, clutching folders and papers, looking nervous but determined. My pulse quickened. The moment I had anticipated, rehearsed in my mind countless times, was finally here. She stopped at the water's edge, hands on her hips, glaring at me like I had personally ruined her entire day. "We need to talk about this lake," she said, her voice sharp, almost trembling with frustration. I nodded politely, keeping my expression calm. "I'm listening," I replied, nothing more. The silence hung heavy, the only sound the gentle lapping of water against the shore. She began waving her papers as if the physical motion could somehow lend authority to her words. "This notice, it doesn't change anything. The community has traditions, rights, and expectations. You can't just ignore them." I raised an eyebrow, letting the absurdity of her argument sink in. "Traditions, expectations?" I asked, my tone calm. "I own the property, the lake is included. The law supports that ownership. Traditions don't override the deed or state law." Her face reddened and she gestured wildly. One of the board members stepped forward, trying to interject with legal jargon but faltered mid-sentence. I could see the panic in their eyes. They had no backup, no argument that could withstand the clarity of the notice I had sent. The tension was electric, hanging over the lake like a storm about to break. I took a step closer to the water, letting my presence feel confident but non-threatening. "I understand your concerns," I said evenly, "but the notice clearly outlines the boundaries of my property and the rights associated with it. Any attempt to override this notice would be considered trespassing." The words hit them like a hammer. I could see the president freeze, the air thick with disbelief. She had expected a fight, maybe some confusion, but certainly not clarity backed by law. One of the younger board members whispered something under her breath, clearly realizing the magnitude of the mistake they had made. The president snapped at her, but it was too late. The cracks were showing. The authority she had tried to wield so confidently was evaporating before my eyes, replaced by frustration, embarrassment, and an undeniable recognition that I had the upper hand. The confrontation stretched on, minutes that felt like hours, each second dripping with tension. I let her rant, let the papers shake in her hands, let the futile arguments pile up around us. And all the while, I remained calm, collected, letting the law and common sense speak louder than anger or ego. Every attempt to intimidate me only reinforced the absurdity of their behavior. Finally, she paused, out of breath, searching for something to say that would regain control. I didn't interrupt. I waited, letting the silence weigh on her. The ripples of the lake mirrored my calm, steady presence, a quiet counterpoint to her frantic energy. In that moment, it became painfully clear to everyone standing there. The board had no leverage. Their threats, their traditions, their imagined rights were powerless against clear, documented legal authority. After what felt like an eternity, she finally turned, muttering under her breath, and started back toward the parking lot. The remaining board members followed, glancing nervously at each other. I watched them leave, my body relaxed but alert, knowing that while this confrontation was over, the story wasn't quite finished. The suspense would linger, rumors would spread, and the board would have to rethink every strategy moving forward. I stayed by the lake for a long time after they left, the water reflecting the fading sunlight, the calm contrasting sharply with the storm that had just passed. The tension had been broken, the confrontation won, but the lesson was clear. Sometimes authority only exists until someone knows their rights, and in this case, the knowledge was all the leverage I needed. As I walked back to the house, I felt a thrill of satisfaction. The confrontation had been intense, dramatic, and absurd all at once, but I had remained unshaken. The lake was mine, and the board had been forced to recognize it. Yet deep down, I knew that the drama wasn't over. There would be meetings, calls, maybe attempts to save face, but the suspense of who would blink first had shifted firmly in my favor. Sitting at my desk that evening, looking at the lake through the window, I realized something. Power isn't in threats, meetings, or shouting. It's in preparation, knowledge, and patience. The HOA had tried to intimidate me, but they had failed. And now, with calm authority, I could sit back and watch as the next chapter unfolded, knowing the suspense was far from over and the final resolution was close at hand. The very next day, the HOA called a special board meeting. The email was formal, urgent, and dripping with panic. They wanted to discuss the situation regarding the lake. I read it and let out a quiet chuckle. After yesterday's confrontation, it was obvious they still hadn't grasped that the balance of power had shifted. The notice, the police visit, the confrontation at the lake, it had all been a prelude to this moment. Now the suspense was building toward the final showdown. I arrived at the meeting room early, taking a seat near the back. The air was tense, thick with the awkward mix of authority and uncertainty. Board members shuffled papers, whispered to each other, and shot anxious glances my way. The president arrived last, face red, voice clipped, trying to maintain control, but her tension betrayed her. She had hoped that this meeting would intimidate me or force a compromise, but I was calm, composed, and prepared. The meeting began with the usual formalities, but it quickly descended into chaos. The president tried to present her case, waving documents and citing community expectations as if they carried any weight against the law. Every point she made was met with my calm responses. "The notice clearly outlines the legal boundaries," I said evenly. "Any action against the property as outlined would be invalid and could be considered trespassing." I could see the frustration mounting in her eyes. The board members were flipping through papers, searching for a loophole but finding none. The tension in the room was palpable. Whispers, muttered arguments, and awkward silence punctuated the meeting. One board member tried to argue that the community had historical access, but I calmly explained that precedent does not override legal ownership. Another attempted to suggest compromise, perhaps allowing limited access under their rules, but I shook my head. This wasn't a negotiation. The notice had set the boundaries clearly, and there was no room for ambiguity. The suspense built with every passing minute. I could feel the room watching me as much as I was observing them. The president's hands were shaking slightly, the younger members avoiding eye contact, and the secretary kept glancing nervously at the clock. It was almost cinematic, the board desperately trying to assert authority, me sitting quietly, legally untouchable, letting their desperation speak for itself. I let them speak, letting the absurdity of their arguments fill the room, while I remained still, my calm a stark contrast to their frantic energy. Their attempts to twist facts, traditions, or interpretations of rules only made their position weaker. I watched as their confidence crumbled, their carefully rehearsed points falling apart. The suspense wasn't just mine. It was in the room, thick and almost tangible, as everyone realized the board had no leverage. Finally, after what felt like hours, the president slammed her hands on the table and muttered something about reevaluating procedures. The room fell silent. I leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet settle. It was over. The board had been forced to acknowledge the notice, my ownership, and the limits of their authority. Every frantic email, every phone call, every absurd claim had culminated in this moment of recognition. Even as I left the meeting, the suspense didn't fully dissipate. I knew the board would discuss it privately, try to recover some semblance of control, maybe even plan further actions. But the narrative had shifted. They had been forced to accept the reality that the lake was mine, and their attempts to challenge it were futile. I could feel a sense of calm triumph, but also anticipation. This was the final act before the ultimate resolution. Walking back to my car, I thought about the absurdity of the situation. Weeks ago, I was enjoying my lake in peace. Now I had navigated police visits, frantic emails, confrontations, and a chaotic board meeting, all because of people who couldn't understand the limits of their authority. And yet, the suspense had made it exhilarating. It was almost like watching a slow-burning drama unfold, and I was the lead who refused to be intimidated. By the time I returned home, the sun was setting over the water. The lake shimmered, peaceful and untouchable, reflecting the calm after the storm. I sat by the edge, thinking about everything that had transpired. The board had been stunned, forced to confront their mistakes, and now the final resolution was within reach. The suspense, the tension, and the drama had led to this moment. All that remained was the closing chapter, the day when the lake's status was cemented, and the board finally understood that their authority ended at the waterline. And as I watched the last rays of sunlight glitter across the surface, I felt a sense of anticipation. The final confrontation was done, but the ultimate victory, the acknowledgement, the peace, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing the lake was truly mine, was just around the corner. The story wasn't over yet, but the suspense had reached its peak, and soon everything would fall into place. The day finally arrived. The lake was calm, the water sparkling under the morning sun, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of quiet anticipation rather than tension. After the special board meeting and the notice, the drama had reached its climax. But I knew that the final acknowledgement, the moment when the board would have to accept reality, was still ahead. The suspense lingered, thick and palpable, like the calm before a storm. I walked to the edge of the lake, taking in the peaceful scene. The sunlight reflected off the water, shimmering like a promise of victory. I could hear the distant hum of cars approaching. The HOA president and a few board members had come again, probably hopping to intimidate, to make one last attempt at reclaiming control. But this time, it was different. The notice had done its work. The confrontation at the lake had exposed their weaknesses, and now I was prepared for anything. She arrived, papers in hand, but the confidence that had carried her in the past was gone. Her steps were hesitant, her gestures sharp but uncertain. She looked at me, trying to assert authority, but the letter and the previous confrontation had already shifted the balance. I greeted her calmly, letting the weight of my presence and the law speak louder than any words she could muster. "I assume you've reviewed the notice," I said evenly, "and understand the legal limits regarding access to this property." She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The board members behind her shifted nervously, exchanging glances. The tension hung heavy in the air. I could almost feel their frustration, their disbelief, their embarrassment. The law, clear and unambiguous, was on my side, and there was nothing they could do. Finally, she muttered something about community relations and precedent, but it was weak, almost defeated. I shook my head gently. Precedent doesn't override ownership. The notice clearly outlines the boundaries and the legal rights associated with this property. Any attempt to ignore it would be a violation. The words landed like a hammer. The room, or rather the few people standing awkwardly at the water's edge, fell silent. The suspense in that silence was almost unbearable. I watched as the president's face flushed, her frustration mounting, until she finally lowered her papers and stepped back. It was the acknowledgement I had been waiting for, the final recognition that the lake was mine, completely and legally untouchable. The board had lost, not in a dramatic court battle, but in a quiet, undeniable confrontation backed by law and careful preparation. As they walked away, muttering to each other, I stood by the water and let out a slow breath. The tension dissolved, replaced by relief and triumph. Weeks of absurd emails, police visits, frantic meetings, and confrontations had led to this moment. The lake was mine, fully and peacefully, without a single compromise. The suspense had been drawn out, building with each encounter, each notice, each confrontation, and now it was finally over. I walked along the shoreline, the sunlight sparkling on the ripples, feeling the full weight of the victory. The board would no longer harass me, no longer threaten, no longer attempt to impose authority where they had none. The knowledge, patience, and careful planning had paid off. One notice, backed by law, had ended weeks of tension and absurdity. It was satisfying beyond words. As I sat on a dock I had built, looking out over the water, I reflected on the experience. The absurdity of the situation had been remarkable, almost comical at times, but the suspense and drama had made every moment intense. The lake, calm and untouched, had become a symbol of standing firm, knowing your rights, and facing intimidation with patience and preparation. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the water, I realized something important. The lake would remain mine, not because I was aggressive or confrontational, but because I was informed, prepared, and confident in the law. The HOA had tried to push, to threaten, to involve others, but in the end, the truth and the notice had prevailed. I smiled quietly to myself, letting the last rays of sunlight dance on the water. The suspense had ended, the drama had concluded, and the lake was mine forever. The HOA might continue to grumble, might whisper among themselves, but their power over this property was gone. I had won, not with anger or force, but with knowledge, patience, and careful strategy. The story of the lake had reached its satisfying conclusion, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace, standing on the shore of my own victory. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one, the truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.